Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a subject that has cast a long, painful shadow throughout history: anti-Semitism. It's a topic, often misunderstood, sometimes simplified, but deeply complex. Our mission today isn't just to skim the surface, it's to really try and understand its journey through time and how it continues to manifest.
Yeah, and what's truly fascinating about the source material we have is that it lets us trace anti-Semitism not just as like a static prejudice, but as this evolving force, almost a chameleon of hatred, really. We're going to explore how its nature and manifestation have shifted and, from ancient times right up to the present day. And critically, we'll examine the profound, often tragic influence Christianity had on its early development.
So what does this all mean for you, our curious listener, as you navigate today's world? By the end of this deep dive, you'll have a clear grasp of three key things: how anti-Semitism has transformed through history, the pivotal role Christianity played in shaping its early forms, and you'll even learn who first coined the very term anti-Semitism and why that moment was so, well, significant.
It raises an important question, doesn't it? How can we genuinely comprehend current events without understanding their deep historical roots? Our aim is really to connect those dots for you, moving beyond the headlines to give you the foundational knowledge to truly be well informed on this critical subject.
Right. To really get to grips with this, let's start with a foundational question. What exactly is anti-Semitism? Our sources define it as hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious or racial group. But here's where it starts to get quite interesting right away. The term itself is surprisingly modern.
That's right. It might feel like a term that's always been around, but anti-Semitism was actually coined in 1879 by a German agitator named Wilhelm Marr. His explicit purpose was to designate the specific anti-Jewish campaigns that were gaining, well, alarming momentum in Central Europe at that particular time. Marr even went as far as forming the League of Anti-Semites in Berlin, also in 1879, specifically to voice and gain support for his opposition to Jews.
Wow. So he was actively trying to formalize and organize this hatred. And the word Semitic itself, that often gets misused, doesn't it? What's the false premise embedded in his choice of words?
It's a crucial point, really. The term Semitic actually refers to a group of languages like Hebrew, Amharic, Arabic. It is absolutely not a racial category. Despite that clear linguistic meaning, Marr deliberately and misleadingly used it to imply a biological racial basis for his hatred, sort of giving it a pseudoscientific veneer.
That's chilling how he tried to legitimize it that way. So if the term is modern and used with this false racial pretense, how does this new coined anti-Semitism differ from earlier forms of prejudice? Because it sounds like he's trying to package something old in a terrifying new way.
Precisely. That's where the concept of racialized anti-Semitism becomes so vital to understand. This asserts the deeply false idea that Jews are a distinct race of people with fixed, inherently inferior traits. Traits they're supposedly born with, immutable and inescapable. This dangerous notion, while championed by Marr in the 19th century, actually has even earlier roots. It developed in 15th century Spain.
15th century Spain, that's quite a leap back from Marr. What was happening there that connects to this idea of racialized anti-Semitism?
Well, in Spain at that time, even Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity, they were known as conversos. Even they faced severe prohibitions. They were forbidden from entering universities, enlisting in the military, holding certain government positions, marrying non-Jews. It was a period of intense religious and social upheaval, with hundreds of thousands of Jews and Muslims being expelled from Spain or killed. The implication was, even if you convert, your blood is still somehow tainted.
That's a profound and deeply disturbing connection across centuries. So this idea of Jews as a distinct and inferior race clearly wasn't brand new, but it truly took on a terrifying new life with Marr. What made it so much more potent and destructive when it was weaponized in this particular way?
The key was that these racist attitudes toward Jews unfortunately persisted. They integrated into emerging pseudoscientific theories of race. As Western European countries and the U.S. expanded their power in the late 19th century, certain scientists in these regions created these false theories of race, specifically to justify and preserve white Christian dominance. And it's in this intellectual, albeit warped, climate that Marr and others were operating. Racialized anti-Semitism was absolutely central to the Nazi worldview that culminated in the Holocaust in the mid-20th century.
And it continues to echo today, doesn't it? Especially with white supremacy movements.
Absolutely. White nationalists today promote the utterly baseless belief that Jews disguise themselves as white people to gain power, wealth, and status. This not only upholds the myth of Jews as a distinct inferior race, but it also perpetuates the generalization that all Jews identify as white, which, by the way, completely ignores the reality that, according to a 2021 Pew Research Center report, 15% of American Jews aged 18 to 29 identified with other racial or ethnic categories. So, to be abundantly clear, racialized anti-Semitism was, and unequivocally is, a form of racism.
So while the term anti-Semitism is a relatively modern invention, the hostility itself certainly isn't. To understand its deeper origins, let's journey back to the ancient world. Where did these deeply rooted prejudices first begin to surface?
Right. Anti-Semitism, to some extent, existed wherever Jews settled outside of Palestine. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, the primary basis for this hostility was, well, religious differences. During the Hellenistic Age, particularly from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE, Jews' social segregation and their refusal to acknowledge the gods worshipped by other peoples, that stirred resentment among some pagans. Judaism, unlike the prevalent polytheistic religions, is famously monotheistic, recognizing only one god. Pagans often interpreted Jews' principled refusal to worship emperors as gods as a sign of disloyalty, which further fueled animosity.
And this is where it gets particularly impactful for the course of history. The early, incredibly complex relationship between Judaism and Christianity.
It's critical to remember that Jesus of Nazareth and his disciples were practicing Jews. Christianity itself is deeply rooted in Jewish monotheism. However, Judaism and Christianity became rivals soon after Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate, executed according to contemporary Roman practice. Initially, this rivalry was primarily theological, but it very quickly became political as well. Historians largely agree that the definitive break between the two religions followed the Roman destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70 CE and the subsequent exile of Jews.
That's a powerful and tragic turning point. How did this devastating defeat impact the narratives about Jesus' death, and what was the consequence for Jews?
Well, both Jews and Christians interpreted this devastating defeat as a sign of divine punishment. In the aftermath, the Gospels themselves began to diminish Roman responsibility for Jesus' death, while explicitly and implicitly expressing Jewish culpability. Matthew 27.25 is a prominent example of this. Jews were increasingly depicted as killers of the Son of God. Christianity was intent on replacing Judaism by making its own particular message universal. The New Testament was presented as fulfilling the Old Testament, which is the Hebrew Bible, and Christians were seen as the new Israel, both in flesh and in spirit. The idea was that the God of justice had now been replaced by the God of love.
That idea of God being finished with the Jews is incredibly harsh. Can you give us a sense of how that teaching of contempt, as you called it, was concretely articulated, maybe through specific rhetoric or church practices back then?
Yeah, it became known as the teaching of contempt. From influential figures like St. Augustine in the 4th century, all the way to Martin Luther in the 16th, some of the most influential Christian theologians excoriated the Jews. They were denounced as rebels against God and murderers of the Lord, described as companions of the devil and a race of vipers. Pretty strong stuff. Church liturgy, particularly the scriptural readings for the Good Friday commemoration of the crucifixion, significantly contributed to this profound enmity. As Christianity spread and became the dominant religion in the Roman Empire by the 4th century, Jews were increasingly regarded as an alien people who, because of their repudiation of Christ, were condemned to perpetual migration, a belief vividly illustrated in the legend of the Wandering Jew.
So this theological stance translated directly into legal realities that profoundly impacted Jewish life. What were the actual consequences?
Exactly. Christian leaders inspired Roman emperors to enact numerous laws designed to segregate Jews and curtail their freedoms whenever their presence seemed to threaten Christian religious domination. The consequence was that Jews were increasingly forced to the margins of European society. It's important to note, though, that the Roman Catholic Church finally renounced these deeply entrenched views with the Vatican II Declaration of Nostra Aetate in 1965.
Decades after the Holocaust.
Decades after. A monumental shift, yes, but a tragically late one.
So this teaching of contempt wasn't just abstract theology. It had very real, very tangible consequences for Jews living in medieval Europe. What did that look like day to day for communities?
Well, the religious attitudes directly reflected in the economic, social, and political life of medieval Europe. In much of Europe during the Middle Ages, Jews were denied citizenship and its associated rights. They were barred from holding posts in government and the military, and crucially, they were excluded from membership in guilds and professions. Now, it's important to add some nuance here. Some European rulers and societies, particularly in the early Middle Ages, did offer a degree of tolerance and acceptance. It wasn't an unchanging, unceasing manifestation of anti-Jewish oppression throughout the entire period.
Okay, so pockets of tolerance. But that relative tolerance seems to have been short-lived, with devastating consequences later on. When did this surge in violence truly begin?
That began to shift dramatically with the First Crusade in 1096. The Knights unleashed a terrifying wave of anti-Semitic violence across France and the Holy Roman Empire, including massacres in cities like Worms, Trier, and Metz. And around this time, we start to see the emergence of some truly shocking and frankly baseless accusations.
You're referring to the infamous blood libel and host desecration accusations, aren't you? What made these so pervasive and dangerous?
Absolutely. The 12th century saw the emergence of notorious and utterly unfounded accusations like ritual murder and host desecration. Most infamously, the blood libel. These were allegations of Jews sacrificing Christian children at Passover to obtain blood for unleavened bread. Completely false, of course. The most famous example was that of the murder of William of Norwich in England. But these accusations were revived sporadically in Eastern and Central Europe throughout the medieval and modern periods. Shockingly, in the 1930s, the blood libel became a central part of Nazi propaganda. Another instrument of medieval anti-Semitism, the compulsory yellow badge that identified the wearer as a Jew, was also revived by the Nazis centuries later. This era also saw the practice of segregating Jewish populations of towns and cities into ghettos. That originated in the Middle Ages and persisted until the 19th and even early 20th centuries in much of Europe.
It wasn't just a physical and social separation, but also an economic one that often created deep tensions, right?
Yes, that's a key part of the picture. As European commerce grew in the late Middle Ages, some Jews became prominent in trade, banking, and money lending. This economic and cultural success, combined with the traditional religious prejudice, often aroused intense envy among the populace. It's crucial to understand why Jews were often involved in money lending. Pre-modern Christianity didn't permit money lending for interest. And because Jews generally couldn't own land, these roles became vital for trade and commerce. It was one of the few avenues open. This mix of economic resentment and religious prejudice then prompted the forced expulsion of Jews from several countries and regions.
Imagine the scale of that upheaval. Entire communities uprooted from places they had called home for generations.
Right.
Where did this happen?
We see this in England in 1290, France in the 14th century, Germany in the 1350s, Portugal in 1496, Provence in 1512, and the Papal States in 1569. And Spain is a particularly stark and tragic example. Intensifying persecution there culminated in 1492 in the forced expulsion of that country's large and long-established Jewish population. Only Jews who had converted to Christianity were allowed to remain, and those suspected of secretly continuing to practice Judaism faced brutal persecution under the Spanish Inquisition.
And as a direct result, where did Jewish life begin to flourish instead? Where did people go?
As a direct result of these mass expulsions, the centers of Jewish life profoundly shifted from Western Europe and Germany to Turkey, and then increasingly to Poland and Russia. However, it's worth noting that where Jews were needed, they were tolerated. Living as they did at the margins of society, Jews often performed economic functions vital to trade and commerce. In medieval Spain, before their expulsion in 1492, Jewish philosophers, physicians, poets, and writers were among the leaders of a rich cultural and intellectual life shared with Muslims and Christians. In collaboration with Arab scholars and thinkers in the more tolerant society of Muslim Spain, they were instrumental in transmitting the intellectual heritage of the classical world to medieval Christendom.
Now, what about the Protestant Reformation? You'd think a period of intense theological reevaluation might offer some respite from these ancient animosities. Was that the case? Did things change?
Sadly, no. The idea that the Jews were evil persisted even during the Protestant Reformation. While Martin Luther initially expressed positive feelings about Jews, especially earlier in his life, he even relied on Jewish scholars for his translation of the Hebrew Scriptures into German. He became furious with Jews over their continued rejection of Jesus. His later writings took a really dark turn.
How dark are we talking? What kind of language did he actually use?
He famously wrote, "We are at fault for not slaying them. Rather, we allow them to live freely in our midst, despite their murder, cursing, blaspheming, lying, and defaming."
Wow, that's incredibly harsh.
It is. It reflects a deep-seated frustration and animosity. These views were later emphasized by the Nazis during the Holocaust, which is a horrifying connection. It's important to note that such views were later renounced by the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in 1983 and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America in 1994.
You'd think the Enlightenment, with its focus on reason, might usher in a new era of tolerance. But this is where the nature of anti-Semitism really begins to transform again, taking on a new, insidious character. distinct from its purely religious roots.
Indeed. The end of the Middle Ages brought surprisingly little immediate change in Jews' position in Europe. The Catholic Reformation actually renewed anti-Jewish legislation and reinforced the system of ghettoized segregation in Roman Catholic countries. Jews remained subject to occasional massacres, like those during wars between Eastern Orthodox Ukrainians and Roman Catholic Poles in the mid-17th century. Those tragically rivaled the worst massacres of the Middle Ages. Periodic persecutions continued in Western Europe until the late 18th century, when the Enlightenment did begin to change their position, at least in the West. But, importantly, it did not necessarily reduce anti-Semitism.
So it shifted from a religious blame to something else.
How did Enlightenment thinkers, who were ostensibly about reason, still harbor these prejudices? Precisely. Although major Enlightenment figures championed reason in debunking what they saw as the superstitions of Christian belief, their thinking didn't lead to any greater acceptance of Jews. Instead of holding Jews responsible for the crucifixion, Enlightenment thinkers like Denis Diderot and Voltaire blamed them for the advent of Christianity itself, and for the injustices and cruelty committed by followers of monotheistic religions. They pilloried the Jews as a group alienated from society who practiced a primitive and superstitious religion. It was a new form of critique, but still blaming, you know.
And then the French Revolution comes along, promising liberty, equality, and fraternity for all. Did that fundamentally alter things for Jews across Europe?
Well, until the French Revolution of 1789, the status of Jews in Europe remained tenuous. They were treated as outsiders, few civil rights, taxed as a community, not as individuals. Exclusion from the larger society actually reinforced their religious identity and strengthened their communal institutions, which served judicial and quasi-governmental functions. The French Revolution, with its promise of liberty, equality, and fraternity, did indeed extend the rights of citizenship to Jews.
That sounds like a monumental step forward. But there was a catch, wasn't there? A significant caveat attached.
There was, and it's a crucial one. Respect and rights were explicitly conditioned on the willingness of Jews to abandon their age-old customs and their communal identity. This was famously summarized by the slogan, "To the Jews as individuals, everything. To the Jews as a people, nothing."
Oof.
Yeah. France was the vanguard of this movement to grant civic and legal equality. Napoleon's conquest of the German states led to emancipation in some of them, but after his defeat, Jews faced a series of legal setbacks. Full emancipation of Jews throughout Germany only came with the unification of Germany in 1871.
But even with emancipation, anti-Semitism didn't just disappear. It simply transformed. This is where the concept of race becomes critically intertwined in a much more explicit and dangerous way, leading back to where we started with Wilhelm Marr.
That's the insidious part. Even in France itself, emancipation didn't end anti-Semitism, but merely transformed it. With the emergence of nationalism as the defining factor in European society in the 19th century, anti-Semitism acquired a racial rather than a religious character. The idea was that ethnically homogenous peoples decried the existence in their midst of alien Jewish elements. Pseudoscientific theories asserting that the Jews were inferior to the so-called Aryan race gave anti-Semitism new respectability and popular support, unfortunately, especially in countries where Jews could be made scapegoats for existing social or political grievances.
So it wasn't just a general prejudice anymore. It became a powerful political tool. Can you give us some examples of how this played out in real-world politics?
Absolutely. In this new climate, politicians quickly discovered anti-Semitism's power. In the 1890s, Karl Lueger, for instance, won the mayoralty of Vienna, a city of diverse culture and many Jews, with his anti-Semitic campaigns. In both Germany and Austria in the late 19th century, anti-Semitism became an organized movement with its own political parties. The Russian Empire was also a particularly harsh environment during this time. They had restricted Jews to western regions known as the Pale of Settlement ever since the partitions of Poland in the 1790s brought large numbers of Jews under Russian rule.
And the Russian government even enacted specific laws to tighten the noose, didn't they? What were the consequences of those laws?
Yes. The Empire's May Laws of 1882, enacted after widespread anti-Jewish riots, or pogroms, had broken out in the Russian Pale the previous year. Those stripped Jews of their rural landholdings and restricted them to the towns and cities within the Pale. These measures severely hindered many Jews' activities as rural traders and artisans, and they spurred the immigration of more than 1 million Jews to the United States over the next 4 decades. Another result was a somewhat smaller immigration of Jews to the countries of Western Europe, where anti-Semitic agitators exploited xenophobic sentiments against them. In France, the Dreyfus Affair became a major focal point for anti-Semitism. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a highly placed Jewish army officer, was falsely accused of treason. His final vindication in 1906 was severely hampered by the French military and the bitterly anti-Semitic French press, and the wrenching controversy over the case left lasting scars on French political life.
So we see this shifting but horrifyingly consistent animosity. Was there any pause before the cataclysm of the 20th century, or did it just build relentlessly?
There was a period of moderate decline in anti-Semitic tensions during the first decade of the 20th century, except notably in Russia, where serious pogroms occurred in Kishinev in 1903 and 1905. It was also in Russia where the secret police published a forgery entitled Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This document, purporting to be a Jewish plot to achieve world domination, provided a ready source of propaganda for subsequent generations of anti-Semitic agitators. Following World War I, the widespread economic and political dislocations across Europe notably intensified anti-Semitism after the war. The presence of many Jewish Bolshevik leaders in the Russian Revolution of November 1917 also gave anti-Semites a new focus for their prejudices in the threat of Jewish Bolshevism. And in post-war Germany, anti-Semites explicitly joined forces with revanchist nationalists in attempting to blame the Jews for that country's defeat. In Eastern Europe, anti-Semitism became widespread in Poland, Hungary, and Romania in the interwar period.
All this history, these evolving forms of hatred, tragically culminated in the 20th century in something truly unprecedented. Let's now bring our discussion to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust.
Right. The storm of anti-Semitic violence unleashed by Nazi Germany under Adolf Hitler from 1933 to 1945 not only reached a terrifying intensity within Germany itself, but also inspired anti-Jewish movements elsewhere. Groups like the Kagulars in France, the Arrow Cross in Hungary, the British Union of Fascists in England, and the German-American Bund and the Silver Shirts in the United States.
This is where the racial dimension, which we touched on earlier, reached a terrifying and absolute intensity, unlike anything seen before. What was the core of this Nazi ideology?
In Nazi Germany, anti-Semitism reached a racial dimension never before experienced. Unlike earlier forms where Christianity sought the conversion of Jews or political leaders sought their expulsion because Jews practiced Judaism, the Nazis regarded Jews not just as members of a subhuman race, but as a dangerous cancer that would destroy the German people. The Nazis sought the final solution to the Jewish question. That meant the murder of all Jews, men, women, children, and their complete eradication from the human race. In Nazi ideology, Jewishness was perceived as biological, so the elimination of the Jews was considered essential for the purification and even the salvation of the German people.
That's a truly chilling concept, the idea that an entire group had to be eliminated for the salvation of another. And what's particularly horrifying is that this brand of anti-Semitism crossed class barriers, didn't it? It appealed to so many different groups.
Indeed. This horrifying novelty of the Nazi brand of anti-Semitism was that it crossed class barriers. The idea of Aryan racial superiority appealed both to the masses and to economic elites. In Germany, anti-Semitism became official government policy. It was taught in the schools, elaborated in scientific journals and research institutes, promoted by a huge, highly effective propaganda machine. In 1941, the liquidation of European Jewry became official party policy. During World War II, an estimated 5.7 million Jews were exterminated by mobile killing units, in death camps like Auschwitz, Chelmno, Belzec, Moshnanek, Treblinka, or through forced labor and starvation.
After such an unimaginable horror, one might hope that anti-Semitism would simply vanish, that the world would finally learn. But history, unfortunately, rarely works that way. It simply changed its shape once more.
For a period after the Nazi defeat in 1945, anti-Semitism did lose favor in Western Europe and the United States. Even those who harbored anti-Semitic views were hesitant, maybe even embarrassed, to express them publicly. American Jews became an integrated part of culture and society in the post-war U.S. Barriers to complete Jewish participation in business and politics fell. Jews generally found few obstacles as they sought to participate in American life. Anti-Semitism became more of a fringe phenomenon, with only occasional lethal manifestations and hate crimes.
So an initial period of relative quiet, at least in some places, but then it persisted in other parts of the world. Where did we see it continue?
Regrettably, yes, it persisted in many other countries. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, whose troops actually liberated Auschwitz. He engaged in a purge of Jews that was only halted by his death in 1953. In the Soviet Union, opposition to the State of Israel after the Six-Day War in 1967 and to the attempts of Soviet Jews to emigrate was often linked to historic Russian anti-Semitism. There were also anti-Jewish purges in Poland in 1956-57 and again in 1968.
Earlier, we talked about the Catholic Church's teaching of contempt and its profound impact for centuries. The post-Holocaust era saw a dramatic turning point for the Catholic Church. though maybe not without its own ongoing complexities. How significant was this shift?
You're right, this was a monumental shift, and many hoped it would signal a new chapter. Under the leadership of Pope, later Saint, John XXIII and the Second Vatican Council, the Roman Catholic Church finally accepted the legitimacy of Judaism as a continuing religion, and crucially, exonerated Jews for the murder of Jesus Christ by universalizing responsibility for his crucifixion. This was enshrined in Nostra Aetate in 1965, arguably the most important document in Christian-Jewish relations in the 20th century. It also changed the Good Friday liturgy to make it less inflammatory regarding Jews and altered the Roman Catholic Catechism.
That's a huge doctrinal and liturgical change.
Right.
But you mentioned complexities. Were there still lingering issues, even after such a major declaration?
There were. In 2007, Pope Benedict XVI approved wider use of the Old Latin Mass, which included the Old Good Friday liturgy and a prayer that most Jews found offensive. Although the prayer was revised in 2008 to address Jewish concerns, some still argued that it was prejudicial. However, a centerpiece of the papacy of Pope, later Saint John Paul II, who actually witnessed the Holocaust directly as a young man in Poland, was the fight against anti-Semitism and his embrace of Jews. The Pope paid a historic visit to a synagogue in Rome in 1986, and under his leadership, the Vatican established diplomatic relations with the State of Israel in 1993, shortly after the conclusion of the Oslo peace agreement between Israel and the PLO.
John Paul II's efforts sound particularly impactful. How did he continue to address this painful history during his time?
In March 2000, the pontiff visited Israel. At Yad Vashem, Israel's memorial to the Holocaust, he described anti-Semitism as anti-Christian in nature, and specifically apologized for instances of anti-Semitism by Christians. At the Western Wall, Judaism's most sacred site, he inserted a prayer note of apology for past Christian misdeeds into the stones. This was preceded in 1998 by the Vatican publishing a document titled We Remember, a reflection on the Shoah, which called upon the faithful to reflect upon the lessons of the Shoah. In presenting that document, Edward Idris Cardinal Cassidy, president of the Holy See's Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, said, "Whenever there has been guilt on the part of the Christians, this burden should be a call to repentance."
Despite these significant changes, especially within the church, anti-Semitism didn't fade away. In fact, it found new oxygen in the late 20th century in different parts of the world. What were some of the triggers for its reemergence then?
It's true. Although it might have seemed likely that anti-Semitism would have been dealt a decisive blow by the collapse of the communist bloc in the early 90s and by the transformation of the Catholic Church's teaching. That wasn't the case. In the 1980s and 90s, international controversy over the legacies of Nazism in Austria and Switzerland actually triggered increased anti-Semitism in those countries. Foreign concern over Kurt Waldheim's Nazi past, for example, provoked angry anti-Semitic reactions among some of his supporters during his successful 1986 campaign for the Austrian presidency.
And Switzerland also faced scrutiny around that time, didn't it, related to Nazi activities?
Yes. During the late 1990s, when it was revealed that Swiss banks had laundered Nazi gold, much of it likely confiscated from Jews during World War II, and had failed to return money to Jewish depositors after the war. International criticism and demands for restitution provoked increased anti-Semitism in Switzerland. In post-communist Russia, political opposition to the ruling regime and to the disproportionate representation of Jews among the powerful oligarchy often had anti-Semitic overtones.
And what about Europe, with its growing Muslim immigrant population?
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion about how Middle East events might intensify anti-Semitism there. How do our sources address that?
Well, in Europe, the presence of a large Muslim immigrant population deeply concerned with events in the Middle East was believed by some to have intensified anti-Semitism. Often, the targets of anti-Semitic actions were the most vulnerable of Jews living in immigrant neighborhoods. It was argued by some that the large number of Muslim immigrants and maybe the absence of hate crime legislation led some European politicians to ignore or downplay the significance of anti-Semitic incidents. Furthermore, anti-Semitic myths that in the post-Holocaust era had been largely discarded by Western Europe. Things like the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion and the Blood Libel alarmingly made their way into the Middle East, where they flourished with support from some religious authorities, media, and some governments.
That's a crucial clarification to make, especially when discussing such sensitive topics. Can you elaborate on the historical context for Jews within Islamic societies and how that relationship may have changed over time?
Right. For many centuries, Islamic societies had tolerated Jews as people of the book and dhimmis, which meant they were subordinate yet protected people. They were required to pay special taxes, wear identifying clothing, and live in specified areas, much as other non-believers were treated in Muslim societies. However, the immigration of large numbers of Jews to Palestine in the 20th century and the creation of the State of Israel in 1948 in a formerly Arab region aroused new currents of hostility within the Arab world. Arab hostility to the State of Israel was primarily political or anti-Zionist and religious, rather than racial, according to our sources. Whatever the motivation, however, the result was the adoption of many anti-Jewish measures throughout the Muslim countries of the Middle East. In response, most of the Jewish residents of those countries immigrated to Israel in the decades after its founding. While some observers were quick to argue that Islam is not by its nature anti-Semitic, it's undeniable that currents of fiercely anti-Israel and openly anti-Semitic beliefs were, and are, abroad in the Muslim world.
So even in our supposedly enlightened 21st century, anti-Semitism continues to evolve, presenting new and complex challenges. It's clearly not a relic of the past. It's a living, breathing issue that continues to demand our attention.
It absolutely does. The founders of Zionism and the leaders of the State of Israel had actually presumed that the normalization of the Jewish condition, achieving statehood with its own flag and army, would significantly diminish anti-Semitism. However, from the Yom Kippur War of 1973 onward, the existence of the Israeli state seemed to have the opposite effect for some, fueling rather than quenching the long-standing fires of anti-Semitic hatred. Thus, in the first decades of the new millennium, there seemed to be a marked rise in anti-Semitism globally. These manifestations prompted careful consideration and debate regarding its very definition, leading the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, to adopt a working definition in 2016.
And what does that working definition state? Why was it felt necessary to have a clear definition agreed upon internationally?
It states, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and/or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. Having this definition provided a common framework for understanding and combating anti-Semitism globally. It helps identify it. The vehemence of the anger and attacks against Israel often appeared not to differentiate between Israelis and Jews, with armed attacks aimed at both civilian and military targets. Some of those alarmed by increasing anti-Semitism in the 21st century pointed to examples of Muslim leaders employing anti-Semitic tropes when addressing their own populations. At the same time, the internet linked disparate groups of anti-Semites and provided an online community for previously isolated factions, really amplifying the spread of hateful content.
This is a critical nuance and one that often sparks heated debate. How do we distinguish legitimate criticism of Israeli policy from outright anti-Semitism? This is a question many listeners really wrestle with.
That is a profoundly important question, and the lines can definitely seem blurry sometimes. In many countries, a significant part of the political left became highly critical of Israel. This development was disquieting to many Jews who were once comfortable on the left and felt that their erstwhile allies had turned against Israel or Israeli policies. Some critics of those policies went so far as to compare them to those of Nazi Germany. And in political cartoons, Jewish figures were depicted in a manner sometimes not dissimilar to Nazi propaganda. Controversy embroiled the Labour Party in the United Kingdom, for example, after some of its members were accused of making anti-Semitic remarks back in 2016. Scholars and students of anti-Semitism have really struggled to distinguish between legitimate criticism of policies of the Israeli government and anti-Semitism itself.
And this is where Ned Sharansky's 3D test comes in as a potential tool for our listeners maybe to help navigate this.
Exactly. In 2004, Natan Sharansky, then an Israeli cabinet minister and a one-time Soviet human rights activist, suggested 3 markers to delineate the boundary. Under his 3D test, when one of these elements was detectable, he argued the line had been crossed into anti-Semitism. The first D is double standards, judging Israel by one standard and all other countries by another. The second D is delegitimization, the conclusion that Israel has no right to exist as a state. And the third D is demonization, regarding the Israeli state not merely as wrong-headed or mistaken, but as some kind of demonic force in the contemporary world. If any of those are present, he argued, the criticism moves into anti-Semitism.
That's a very clear framework. At the same time, it's worth noting that many conservative Christians, including many evangelicals, voiced ardent support for Israel. However, we've also seen the rise of nationalistic, xenophobic, far-right movements in the 2010s. How did that impact anti-Semitism?
Well, the nationalistic, xenophobic far-right which often embodied an open or thinly veiled anti-Semitism, while capitalizing on economic dislocation and discontentment with immigration, gained considerable political power in countries such as Greece and Hungary in the early 2010s. Similar political movements later surged in other parts of Europe, including Austria, France, and Italy. The global impact in the rise of the far right was exemplified in widespread conspiracy theories, which often utilized anti-Semitic tropes about the American financier and philanthropist George Soros. He's a Hungarian-born Jew, frequently criticized by Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, for example.
Sadly, these aren't just theoretical discussions or political debates. The 2010s and 2020s have seen measurable, tragic increases in anti-Semitic acts, bringing this historical thread right into our present moment.
Unfortunately, yes. During the 2010s, measurable increases in anti-Semitic rhetoric and attacks were recorded in Europe and North America. These incidents included physical and verbal assaults, as well as vandalism, graffiti, and desecration of Jewish sites. France, which has the largest Jewish population in Europe, saw one of the most notable upticks in vandalism and violence targeting Jewish communities, including a deadly assault on a kosher supermarket in Paris in 2015. According to the Anti-Defamation League, the ADL, which tracks anti-Semitic activity in the United States, anti-Semitic incidents in the country rose sharply after 2015, averaging about 7 incidents per day in 2021. The United States suffered one of its deadliest anti-Semitic attacks in October 2018 when a man opened fire at the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh during services, killing 11 people. Public reflection on the rise of anti-Semitism was renewed in October 2022 when the popular rapper Ye, also known as Kanye West, made a series of public comments that were widely seen as anti-Semitic.
And very recently, the situation in the Middle East has had a profound and immediate impact on anti-Semitism globally, hasn't it? Sparking a lot of concern.
Absolutely. On October 7, 2023, the Palestinian militant organization Hamas led a devastating attack on Israel that killed more than 1,200 people. It was the single deadliest day for Jews since the Holocaust. In the following weeks, as Israel launched a war against Hamas, the ADL recorded 312 anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. That was up significantly from 64 incidents reported in the same period in 2022. Throughout the war, rhetoric against Israel and Zionists spiked, particularly on university campuses, and often in response to the degree of death and destruction in the Gaza Strip. This spike led to increased attention on that critical line between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism masking modern anti-Semitism.
So we've traced this long, difficult, and frankly heartbreaking history. But this raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? Why does anti-Semitism in all its forms seem to persist century after century, adapting and reemerging like this?
It's a crucial question, and it goes to the heart of human behavior, I think. In addition to the broader human tendency to create divisions in societies, often based on racist beliefs, anti-Semitism persists in part because Jews have served as scapegoats, those who are irrationally blamed for societal problems, for over 2,000 years. With scapegoating often comes the creation of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories attempt to explain the occurrence of harmful events, social changes, or even everyday circumstances we don't like by blaming them on a small group of people. According to the Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism, classic anti-Semitism specifically links Jews to forces of evil.
It's like a convenient, self-contained explanation for things that are too complex or uncomfortable to face directly, isn't it? Almost an easy out. What are some common examples of these kinds of anti-Semitic conspiracies?
Exactly that. Some common anti-Semitic conspiracies include the false belief that the Jews control the government, banks, and media, and the false belief that Jews are responsible for spreading disease, such as COVID-19, which we saw recently. Philosophy professor Kwame Anthony Appiah describes conspiracy theory very aptly. He calls it a way of fitting all things that don't fit together, an Earl quote. It's a way of making sense of the world by saying, well, that can't be an accident, so I have to have a story about why it connects. And so someone offers me this preposterous story, but at least it connects two things. He continues, once you've got this sort of mindset, you can see the evidence wherever you look. Understanding the world is hard, and getting explanations is difficult, and making them up as opposed to finding the right ones is easier than finding the truth. This mechanism, the appeal of simple blame, has consistently fueled anti-Semitism through its various transformations.
We've taken a truly sweeping deep dive today, from ancient prejudices rooted in religious difference through the profound and tragic influence of Christianity. The emergence of a racialized anti-Semitism coined in the 19th century, right up to its complex and unfortunately persistent manifestations in the 21st century. It's a challenging history, no doubt, but a vital one to understand.
Yeah, if we connect this to the bigger picture, what really stands out here is the adaptability of prejudice itself. Anti-Semitism has been a chameleon, hasn't it? Changing its colors and justifications across millennia. But at its core, we see that dangerous human tendency toward scapegoating and the allure of simple, often completely preposterous explanations for complex problems.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you navigate a world awash in information and competing narratives? Perhaps the most powerful takeaway is that recognizing the historical patterns of anti-Semitism, how it's mutated from religious to racial, how it leverages conspiracy and blame, gives us a crucial tool. It allows us to identify the underlying mechanisms of prejudice, not just in this context, but potentially in many others, making us more informed and discerning thinkers in a world that desperately needs critical thinking.
Absolutely. There's always more to learn, of course, and we hope this deep dive provides a solid foundation for your continued exploration and understanding.